I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. I did want to introduce our special guest, Callan Waters. She is the Holmes County Extension Director, and she has an extensive background and knowledge in herd reproduction. And she's going to tell you a little bit about herself today, and then we can start with the questions. And if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate. Just unmute yourself, or you can ask them in the chat box down below in the bar there, and we can go from there. So, Callan, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Brittany. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you planning this for us, and hopefully I'll be able to shed some light on herd reproduction. I grew up in the cattle industry. I grew up on a cow-calf operation in southeastern Montana, and my parents developed some replacement heifers and things like that. I went to a junior college in Wyoming and decided that maybe I wanted to keep going to school for a little while. So I ended up going to Oklahoma State University, and I got some cool experiences there, and I got to do some research. And so I decided to go ahead and get my master's. I did my master's at the University of Florida with Cliff Lamb. Had a really great experience there. Got a lot of really good hands-on experience while I was at the research center in Marietta. And then when I graduated from college, I went back to South Dakota and I worked as a county agent there for a little while. And then I went to South or Central Florida, I'll call it. And I worked at Deseret Cattle and Citrus. I was an area manager there for a little while, and I oversaw all of their kind of herd reproduction, their replacement heifer development, their bull development, genetic selection, all the embryo transfer, AI, all that sort of stuff. And then I was the foreman on the purebred unit for a little while. So I really enjoyed my time there. And then when this opportunity opened up for us to move back to the Panhandle, that's where my husband's from. And so we live up here in the Florida Panhandle now. We have our, wonderful thing about the Panhandle of Florida is that we're able to own our own land and our own cattle. It's a lot harder to do that down there where y'all are located at. So we're happy to have our own herd and be able to do our own thing, and we have a good life here. So I'm hopeful that I'll have some experience, and between all of us, we can have a discussion today about reproductive management.
Great. Thank you so much, Callan. That's awesome. Well, I did have some producers send me some questions. Should we start there, or do we want to open it up? Maybe we could start there and then open it up to see if anyone has fresh questions from there. Does that work?
Yeah, that works great.
Okay. So the first question I did have from a producer was, is it better to have two calf crops, crop A in the fall or winter, and then and crop B in the spring to have more profit coming in more than just one time a year?
So initially I would say no. Of course, any breeding season is better than no breeding season. So you've got to start somewhere. When you look at fall managed herds versus spring managed herds, of course, it's a little different as far as the preference of calving season, depending on where you're at. But the whole basis around how we structure our calving season really should be based off of feed availability, which in the Southeast is forage. So look at your peak times of forage and then kind of overlay that with the nutritional requirements of your herd, and you can kind of see when your calving season should be. So obviously we probably have one peak forage season in any system that we work in. And so if you have multiple calving seasons, one of those calf crops is going to obviously cost you more money because it's going to require more supplementation. So one of the things to keep in mind is that your cows should meet peak lactation about 60 days after they calve. That's going to be one of the times that their nutritional requirements are going to be the highest because of that level of milk production. So if you can kind of time your calving season around that peak lactation, and then, you're able to keep your cows in good condition before breeding season, after they calve, you're able to hold them because they're not going to be going backwards when they're lactating and things like that right before you turn the bulls on. They're going to be in a high plane of nutrition. So as far as having two calving seasons just to have multiple times of the year where you have income, from a financial standpoint, there can be some benefits as far as, I guess, cash flow, but really from a management standpoint, and really if you put the pencil to it, I think having one calving season is ideal. Now, in some situations, no, he's not. In some situations,
we're all from home, Kayla. Don't worry about it.
Don't answer that, okay? My daughter just answered the phone for a county commissioner, so I went ahead and hung that one up. She thought it was her daddy. Just hit ignore, Brittany. I'm sorry. Daddy's gone today, so I've got her with me. But so no, story short, I think as far as just so you have income twice a year, you know, cattle producers, we're kind of master budgeters, and I mean, you should be able to budget financially to be able to know what your income's going to be, and know that you're only going to have income one time a year. The other thing to look at that is, you know, if you want to have income a couple times a year, a fall and a spring calving season can have some justification. I wouldn't do it just necessarily so that you can roll cows from one herd to the other, because I think then you're going to really start to see some subfertility creep into your herd.
Okay.
Oh, you're still muted, Brittany.
Thank you. No, sorry. Thank you so much. That was an awesome answer. Second question I did get from a producer was, how soon do cows cycle after calving, and how long is the heat cycle?
Okay, so I'll start, I guess, just with a general overview of the estrus cycle. So, you know, the estrus cycle is 21 days long. So that, you know, your cows, when they're cycling, they should have a cycle every 21 days. Now, following calving, we call that the postpartum interval. So when our cows calve, they're not cycling. And typically, depending on the body condition score of your cows, it's going to take anywhere from 45 to 60 days for those cows to calve. And the reason that that's so, I do have a, hold on, I got a slide I'm going to share. I pulled up a few of my presentations that I had from reproductive management talks. So I'll just go ahead and show this annual production cycle. So we can see in, can y'all see that? Okay, so we can see phase one is what we're kind of talking about, that postpartum interval. Now, if we know that gestation on a cow is 283 days, and then we know we've got about 82 days for that postpartum interval. So that's to keep our cows in an annual breeding season or an annual production cycle, to where they're having a calf every year, which is really what they need to be doing. And so we can see here we've got phase one, and that's that postpartum interval. And it usually takes, and that's the time from when our cows calve until they become pregnant again. And so that usually, if we want them to have a calf every 365 days, they only have 82 days to do that. And so they usually don't even start cycling again until anywhere from 45 to 60 days after they calve. Depending on the body condition score of your cow, that can be longer or shorter. There's a tremendous amount of hormonal imbalances and things like that that those heifers have to overcome. Once they start to try to enter back into that, I'm going to share a link to this article. This is an article I wrote with Cliff Lamb when he was here. I'll put it in the chats. It really overviews that postpartum period of those cows and talks about, you know, why they have to overcome those challenges to start cycling again. So basic answer to the question without any detail is, I guess the cow should be cycling every 21 days, and then it usually takes them between 45 and 60 days to start cycling after they calve. You'll see some really good cows that'll fire back quite a bit quicker than that. You know, 30 days they might cycle, and then you'll see some cows that are going to drag along, and they're going to keep bumping back farther and farther into the breeding season. One way to tell, kind of evaluate cyclicity on your cow herd is that on any given day with a 21-day breeding season, or 21-day estrus cycle, sorry, if you go out and you watch heat on your cow herd to try to figure out if they're cycling or not, on a single day, 5% of your cow herd should be cycling. So however many cows you've got, to figure out kind of if a majority of your cows are cycling or not, just kind of a rule of thumb is that on a daily basis, if you watch heat, you should see about 5% of those cows come into heat.
Thank you. So the third question I did have was how to convert your herd from no breeding season to a controlled breeding season, and why is this important?
Oh man. Okay.
I know that's probably a long answer.
This is going to take a while, but I'll try to be as abbreviated as possible. So when we start thinking about breeding season, I mean, I don't live with my hand in the sand. I know that there's a lot of producers, particularly in the Southeast, that don't have a breeding season. And the worst part of that is if you don't have a breeding season, getting your herd into a breeding season can be really challenging and it can be really expensive. So my first advice is that if you're new to the cattle industry and you're wanting to buy a group of cattle, buy cattle that have a breeding season. Because if you don't buy a set of cows that are grouped up, you're just setting yourself up for failure from the beginning. So the reason why this is so important is when we start to look at profitability and calving distribution. So what I talked about a little bit earlier too, when I shared, we want to have our cows set up to calve based on our forage systems and kind of what's most ideal. And we know that we sell our calves on the pound for the pounds. And so every day that calf is older, he's obviously going to be gaining weight. And typically, our calves in a good production scenario should be gaining anywhere from, 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day when they're on the cow. If you have good producing calves, some of them will even do better than that. So we know every day is costing us 1 pound to 2 pounds a day. And so if we look at the cost and the value of that, we can see that those older calves are worth substantially more than those younger calves. And if we have calves that are born over a 300-day time period versus a 90-day time period, obviously, one, you're able to manage everything about that herd better, and two, you're able to sell your calves as a group, which they typically bring more money when they're sold as a group. You're able to work your calves all at the same time. Just from every aspect of the management scenario, it makes sense to have a breeding season. And so this is just some research that came from North Florida when Cliff Lamb was up here, and he just looked at calving distribution on a group of cows, and you can just see the calves that were born during the first heat cycle of the breeding season on average brought $710, and the calves that were born at the end of a 75-day breeding season only brought $497. And a 75-day breeding season is a pretty tight breeding season, but you can see there's just some simple math there that shows you the variation in calving distribution. Now, when you start to think about other reasons why a breeding season is so important, I think the main thing that we can really think about that makes the most sense to me is the nutritional requirements of the cow herd. So if I have a group of cows and I have cows that are calving, I have cows that are, being bred by the bull right now, I have dry cows and I have heavy bred cows, and I have young cows and I have old cows, and I'm running them all together. This shows us the nutrient requirements for those cows. So which nutrient requirement should I feed to right now? It's just a crapshoot, because really you've got cows in every single phase of the production cycle. And so if you're feeding your dry cows to meet the nutritional requirements of your cows that are calving or, in third stage gestation, fixing to start lactating, you're having to feed a substantial amount more provide TDN, crude protein, to those cows versus your dry cows. So your dry cows are going to be fat as mud, And on the flip side of things, you're going to have lactating cows that are getting thin. And so nutritionally, it makes no sense to manage a herd that doesn't have a breeding season. And I think that if you figured out the nutritional expense that's added to not having a breeding season, that in itself would probably be enough financial incentive to go ahead and try to start working towards a breeding season. When you look at how to establish a breeding season, I think the best way to go, I mean, one, it's not going to be a quick fix. You're not going to just, unless you're willing to put some investment and some capital into it, you can't just pull the plug and say, I'm going to have a breeding season this year. You're going to have cows all spread out. Your cows kind of will probably have, if you've had your herd from a while, have worked towards a breeding season for the simple fact that there's times of the year where there's going to be more nutritional nutrients available, you know, whether you're supplementing in the winter time or whether when that forage is available. Those cows will kind of, you'll see a trend probably where your cows are grouped up a little bit. And so what I typically do with producers is if we can figure out when a majority of those cows are calving, you can kind of try to cut off the front end and cut off the tail end. And then try to work towards that middle point. You can do some things with some natural service synchronization where you're going to utilize some of those hormones that we would maybe typically use in AI to try to push those cows more towards the beginning or the middle point of the breeding season. Long story short, it's really hard to do unless you're willing to hold some cows for a period of time. So you're either going to have to call all the cows out of your herd that don't fit within your breeding season as you kind of try to work them towards it. But at some point you have to take the bulls out and allow those cows to run without a bull for a period of time to be able to establish any sort of a breeding season. So to give you an example, I've got a producer up here I'm working with right now on this exact thing. So we're working to try to establish a breeding season for him. He bought his cows. They were in a probably, I would say, 150-day breeding season when he bought them. Management got a little bit lax. And so then we're trying to work back towards getting those cows in a 90-day breeding season. And one of the things, you know, we had to do is we pulled the bulls out of them last fall and we ran those cows until February without a bull in them. And there was a group of cows that were unproductive during that period of time, but we had to come up with a strategy in a period of time where we were going to start. And so if that's something you need to do, I think every situation's just about different that I've come across with as far as helping people get a breeding season in place. You can work with your county agent. I mean, you can give me a call, however you want to do it. But really, I mean, once you decide to do it, you just got to figure out when you want your breeding season to be. And like I said, you know, try to work those cows to the middle of that date.
Perfect. Thank you. I know that was a long answer. Thank you so much. So does anyone have questions so far? Is everybody doing good on here? If you do, there's a chat or you can unmute yourself. If you do have questions along the way, please let us know. I do have some more questions that a producer sent me, so we can just keep rolling right along. What should you look for, or what is important to look for when selecting replacement heifers?
So when you're thinking about replacement heifers, okay, it's really good just to know what the goals for your cow herd is. So in some instances, maybe your mature cow weight has gotten really big, and so you might not want to keep as framey of replacement heifers. And so you need to have a few production goals that you have in mind when you're working towards selecting replacement heifers. So one of the things I like to look at to start out with replacement heifers, and it's so basic and it's so simple that I think we might try to overcomplicate things sometimes, but it makes a lot of sense. And that's to keep your biggest, heaviest heifers. And I don't want to keep them just because they're the biggest and the heaviest. I want to keep them because they were born first. So when we look at the fertility of our cow herd, if we have cows that are calving at the very beginning of our breeding season, I can make a lot of assumptions about the genetics of that replacement heifer. So to start with, we know that body condition score at calving is a huge indicator of how long it's going to take that cow to breed back. So if I have a cow that's consistently breeding back at the beginning of my breeding season, she's probably a good, easy keeper. She probably stays in good body condition score. Okay, so those older, heavier heifers are probably born to cows who maintain their body condition score throughout the year. The other thing is those cows are pretty fertile because they're consistently getting bred at the beginning of the breeding season. So those heifers that are bigger and heavier have either done one of two things. They've been born at the beginning of the breeding season, or they had a tremendous amount of gain that made up for their late calving. But in general, probably those biggest, oldest heifers in our herd are going to be born at the beginning of the breeding season. And we know that cows that calve at the beginning of the breeding season tend to continue to do so, and over their lifetime, they're going to produce more pounds of calf for us in our herd than a cow that calves at the middle or the end of the breeding season. And so keeping those older, bigger heifers, typically they're coming from cows that are pretty fertile in our herd because they're consistently calving in the first 21 to 42 days of the breeding season. The second thing I'm never going to do is keep a replacement heifer out of a cow that's missed a year. Under no circumstances should you ever keep a replacement heifer out of a cow that wasn't able to have a calf in your herd every year. And I think that that's something that takes a little bit of management. I know in certain scenarios it makes sense to roll cows over and to keep open cows. I understand how management, especially in South and Central Florida, works. And in some of those scenarios, economically, it makes a tremendous amount of sense to run your open cows and roll them over and get them bred at the beginning of the breeding season next year. But if you're doing that, I hope you have enough foresight that you're keeping some sort of record and making sure that you're not keeping replacement heifers out of those cows. Because if that mama wasn't able to perform in your herd, you don't want to continue to bring those subfertile genetics into your herd. And this is something I see a lot of, especially in the Southeast, because it does in certain management scenarios make sense to keep open cows and to rebreed them. And I understand that. But I think probably the biggest thing I have to preach on that is do not keep replacement heifers out of those cows that were open at any point. You know, if she fails to become pregnant for the first time at 2 years old, don't keep a replacement heifer out of her. If she fails to become pregnant at 5 years old and you roll her over, don't keep a replacement heifer out of her. I don't care what her calf looks like. I don't care how big and beautiful and, perfect she is. She's subfertile. Because if I can have cow A and cow B, and cow A has had a calf every single year in my production system, and cow B has skipped, for whatever reason, cow A fits in my production system better. And I know in some cases, it's easy to say, well, we had a really hard year, or, she got a little thin and that's why she skipped, or she calved really late last year. Whatever it is within your management system, she doesn't fit. She didn't make the grade. So if you choose to keep her, that's an economic choice that you have to make, but you should never keep a replacement heifer out of her. And so that's probably one of the biggest things I would have to preach on replacement heifer development is, if you keep replacement heifers out of cows that have skipped a year, then you're just breeding more infertility into your herd. And I've seen scenarios, where that's been done, and over time they see a dramatic decrease in pregnancy because the genetics that you're keeping into your herd are subfertile, and now that subfertility will really capitalize over time, and it kind of creeps up on you. So you want to keep replacement heifers out of cows that have never missed a calf, and out of cows that calve at the beginning of your breeding season. And of course, everybody knows all of the basic things, feet, legs, structure, those types of things. I think, going a little deeper than that is really just looking at the performance of the mama. I think we really think about, when we think about genetics and genetic selection, we think about bulls. But those cows make up half the genetics that are going into their calves. And when you're thinking about replacement heifers, you need to think about how the cows in your herd perform. And look at that when you're keeping replacement heifers.
All right. We did have a question. It says, how about addressing the use of heat synchronization to group your herd's calving?
Sure. Okay. So that works really good. I've done quite a bit of work with synchronization, and I think so when we think about AI, we don't really think in using, you know, artificial insemination. I think when we think about the value, we think about the genetics and all of that sort of stuff. And that's good, but I think the biggest value out of all those reproductive technologies that we use is having 50% of our cows bred on the first day of the breeding season. And I understand in a lot of scenarios, artificial insemination maybe doesn't work right. I mean, if you've got a good bull battery, and you've got some commercial cows set up in a pretty good management system, I think that using synchronization tools to move those cows to the beginning of the breeding season is a tremendous asset. And I've done it a lot in commercial situations, and I can tell you that it works really well. So there's a couple different things that you can do. There's 2 or 3 different protocols that you use. You don't use the same protocols that you're going to use if you're going to artificially inseminate them, just because we don't want to group those cows as tight because we want the bulls to cover them. So some things to look at. In replacement heifers, you can utilize it just the same as you do in a mature cow herd. One group of cows that it knocks it out of the park with, if you run a group of open cows, you give them a single shot of Lutalize or prostaglandin, whatever product you choose to use. Before you turn those bulls in, you're typically within about 8 days going to see 75% of those cows come into heat. So think about that for a minute. Instead of having those cows strung out in, you know, the first 30 days, basically 21-day estrus cycle, because if they're open cows, God help them, hopefully they're cycling. And so if you can get all those cows are probably pretty cyclic, they should respond really well to just a single shot of prostaglandin. You're going to want to put your bulls in there about 1:15 or 1:20 ratio, just because you're going to be forcing a lot of cows into heat at the same time. And I've seen scenarios where, you know, you're going to have 50 to 60% of that group of open cows calve out in the first 15 to 20 days of the calving season. And so that's a way for those cows to make up some of the difference, because you push them to the beginning of the breeding season. If you can get them to the pens and run them through the chute, it's about a $2 shot. So that's about the most simple way to do it. Another way, and you turn the bull in right when you give the shot. So there's another protocol. It's called the prostaglandin 4-day protocol. It's just a little bit different, but you get a little better result. So you're going to turn your bulls in for 4 days, and then you're going to pull everything in and give them a shot of prostaglandin. If you're familiar with AI at all, you're probably thinking this isn't going to work because prostaglandin is going to abort them. But for the first 6 days after a cow ovulates, prostaglandin will not regress that CL. It actually is lutotrophic, or it actually will help the CL grow. So you've got a 4-day window or a 6-day window. So you're going to turn the bulls in, and 4 days later, you're going to come back and give them a shot. Within that system, within 21 days, you should have 100% of your cows cycle, because you're going to catch cows that wouldn't have responded to the prostaglandin shot that are going to get bred by the bull before you give them the shot, and everything that hasn't come into heat in the first 4 days should respond to that shot if they're cycling. So that's probably the most bang for your buck as far as the protocol goes, but you have to be on it. You have to manage that. Day 4, that's the day. I don't care if it's raining. I don't care if there's a hurricane. Day 4 is the day you give your prostaglandin shot. So you don't have very much flexibility with that protocol. If you miss day 4, then you're not going to be able to give your shot, because you're going to be knocking calves out of cows. And then there's another tool that you can use, and that's and so what you can do with that is you can expose those cows to some progesterone. So we know that cows that are having a hard time overcoming their postpartum period, you can, with heifers, you can either feed MGA, or with cows, you can use a cedar. The thing that's nice about just using a prostaglandin shot is it's 1 trip through the chute. If you use a cedar in your cows, it's 2 trips through the chute. But I've seen some instances in some pretty thin first calf heifers that we put cedars in, and it made a huge difference in our conception rate and moving those cows up. and keeping them grouped up in the beginning of the breeding season. So all in all, I mean, depending on when you turn your bulls in, if you can mark and brand around the beginning of your breeding season and give those cows a single shot of prostaglandin, I think that you'll be really happy with the results you see. And there's a lot of instances. And I think probably if you don't utilize it in your replacement heifers, you're missing out on a major tool. You don't have to AI them. I mean, that's an additional management consideration that you could take. But in general, with replacement heifers, I wish it was standard protocol that before you turn the bulls in, you feed them MGA and you turn the bulls in, you know, follow the protocol. But like we talked before about keeping replacement heifers and stuff, same thing applies to those cows. If you can get those heifers bred early for the first time at the beginning of their first breeding season, they will consistently be at the beginning of your breeding season, and it'll help those heifers from falling out or falling back back in the breeding season. You know, if your replacement heifers get bred right at the very tail end of your breeding season, they're going to have a mighty hard time getting bred during the breeding season with their second calf. So if you can use some synchronization protocols and push those heifers to the beginning of their breeding season, I think, you know, in 5 years, you'll be amazed at the difference in your first calf heifer conception rates.
Great, that's awesome, thank you. We did have another question. When does it make sense for a producer to buy replacement heifers over keeping their own replacement heifers? And is this more of a common practice for small size operations?
Yeah, so I think if you have a small herd, it almost always makes sense, depending on how small is considered. If you're keeping replacement heifers out of your own herd and you're not rotating your bull battery every 2 years, you're going to really have a hard time managing inbreeding. If you're keeping heifers and then, you know, you might breed them to a different bull as a replacement heifer and then they go back in your mature cow herd, they're going to get exposed to their daddy, unless you're really rotating your bull out. And so in a lot of smaller situations, it does make sense. If you have a good fertile set of cows and, you know, you have enough room or manage your cows in a way that, you know, those cows aren't getting exposed back to their bull or to their fathers, then, I mean, in a lot of instances, it makes sense to keep replacement heifers if you're set up to manage them and to develop them. If you're not set up to develop them properly, you don't have access to commodity feeds and things like that, it's probably going to make more economic sense just to go out and buy bred heifers. If you're not feeding those heifers and getting them ready to get them bred, if you're going to keep replacement heifers and then just turn them back out with the cow herd, you're going to have low conception rates. They're not going to grow out properly, and you're probably going to be losing money in the long run. So, you know, keeping heifers versus buying heifers, it's kind of different for every person, but I think in general, larger operations where you might have the opportunity to feed out quite a few heifers so you can buy commodity feeds and do it right, and make sure that, you know, they're not getting bred back to their daddy. Scary to know how many times I go to somebody's house and, oh, I kept that bull, I kept this heifer, and I kept this heifer, and I kept this heifer, and they're all in the same group. And I'm thinking, and that's their daddy, and that's who she's bred back to, and you wonder why your calves aren't performing. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense in larger scenarios to develop replacement heifers, and I think it makes a lot of sense for smaller producers to purchase them. And in addition, you know, if you start to see a lot of fertility issues and things in your herd, no matter how big you are, sometimes it makes sense to bring in some outside genetics.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. I do have just a few more questions. I know we're creeping up on time, so we'll see how many we can get in the next.
I'll try to be shorter.
No, you're fine. I like the question. The answers you're giving are wonderful. Thank you so much. So the next question I have is, when is the best time to castrate bull calves to achieve the highest weaning weights?
Okay. So ideally, if you can castrate a calf on the day it's born, that's the best day to do it. You know, when we start to think about castration, we know that those larger animals have a lot higher stress response, that those larger calves have a lot higher stress response and different things like that. I think in the system that most producers in the Southeast at marking and branding, that's when it makes time to castrate calves. A lot of people think I should leave them longer because they're going to grow better. And in some instances, you know, some of those hormones and things that are associated with a bull calf will help produce some extra gain, but all that can be mitigated by an implant that costs $1, and you put it in this ear the same day you castrate. When we start to think about the value of a calf, on average at the stockyard, order buyers are going to pay about $25 a head more for a calf that's been castrated versus a calf that has not been castrated. And that just goes into the fact that those calves, when they go into that stalker situation, wherever they're going to, they have a tremendously higher risk of BRD and all of your different health issues that are associated with stalker calves. So anywhere from 25% up to, some of the research says 95% of those calves are more likely to get sick if you castrate them after they come out of the stockyard or wherever they're coming from. So if we can castrate our calves when they're younger, there's a lot of production benefits as far as when they're being weaned and when they're going into a stalker scenario. On the flip side of it, just from an animal welfare standpoint, the pain and those types of things that are associated with it are a lot less when those calves are younger. You don't have the bleeding issues and different things like that. While we're on the topic, castration methods, knife cutting a calf is the best way to do it. No matter how you look at it, all of the research shows us that acute pain is better than prolonged pain. When you look at a calf's response, when you look at his behavioral response, when you look at stress markers, anything you want to look at, the research's been done 100 different ways, and we know that if you knife cut that calf versus banding him, that he's a lot better off. And I always tell people, would you rather me cut your finger off, or would you rather me put a band on it and you have to sit there and wait for it to rot and fall off? It's a lot less painful. You have a lot less risk of infection and complications. And so I really encourage people, if you don't know how to knife cut your calves, get with someone, have them teach you how to do it properly, whether that's your veterinarian or someone with some experience with that. And it'll increase the performance of those calves. If you can, if you're tagging your calves, you know, there's a lot of people, that's how we do it with our herd. When we tag our calves when they're born, we cut them. Depending on your production system and how you're doing it. If not, marking and branding, when you're giving them their first rounds of shots and stuff, I would say that's the ideal time to do it. And unless you're marketing your calves in a special scenario, I would go ahead and put an implant in them when I castrate them. And at marking and branding, you don't want to implant them when they're born.
Well, perfect. Thank you. The next question I did get was, what is the correct way to place the OB chains when pulling a calf?
I've got a prop for this because Brittany told me that she was going to have this. So the first thing I would say is get yourself if you have cows, you should have a set of OB chains. Hopefully you won't need them, but when you do, they make a big difference. It's a lot easier to pull a calf with a set of OB chains than trying to use a rope or different things like that. If you don't know what an OB chain is, it's just a stainless steel chain. You can get them in different lengths. I like to have 2 or 3 of them. You can get a handle like this that'll come with it to hook to the chain. You can get a calf jack. There's a lot of different tools that can go into pulling a calf. Most calves that you need to pull, unless you've got some pretty major issues, you can usually get them with just, you know, a set of chains and a couple hooks. In some instances, you need a calf jack. So I don't know if you can see this. So when I put a chain on a calf, we make a loop. I'll see if I can do it with one hand. So you're going to put it along the fetlock up above the joint. Oh, Lord Mary, look, my little assistant is going to let me borrow her hand. Okay, so the first one is going to go above the top joint. Then you just put your hand over the top and make a half hitch. And when that chain, I like to keep my chain down the top of the foot. So you're going to put 2 loops. One of them's going to be above the joint and one of them's going to be right below the fetlock. And when you pull that way, you have a lot more even pressure. If you just put that chain on there one time, you're putting all that pressure on that small bone right there at that joint. So when you put a calf chain on a calf, you always want to put your 2 loops on there. Brittany said I had got this question, so let me see if I can find my picture I downloaded without exiting out of my, here we go. So there you go. You're going to half hitch it. You're going to have 1 loop above the fetlock, and the other chain is going to fall right below the dew cloth. Whether you're pulling a, you know, front leg or back leg, you're going to put the chains on there the same way.
Great. I love your assistant. She was awesome.
She told me she wanted to help this morning. And the other thing is put them where you can find them, because mine were not where I thought they were at. I had to this morning. So I'm glad I wasn't looking for them for something timely.
Well, thank you guys. I do have 2 more questions. We can go from there, or we can stop if you guys are done, or what are you guys thinking? Are you down for 2 more questions?
We're good. I'll try to be short.
Okay. The next question I did receive was, what body condition score or months of the year are the most important to make sure heifers and cows are getting adequate nutrition to cycle to be bred?
I'm trying to think where I think they're going with that question. I mean, the simple answer is the body condition your cows calve at is the most critical body condition score that you can manage. But it's a little bit tricky, and I'll show my nutrient requirements slide again, because if you look at their nutrient requirements, by the time they're calving or about to calve, you can't put weight on those cows. You're too late. And so if we're looking at, you know, we want our cows to calve in a body condition score of 5. I think that's pretty common knowledge. But we need to make sure that when our cows are dry or short bred, you know, right after we pull those calves off of them at weaning, they stop lactating, their nutritional requirements go way down. And so if we have a weight issue with our cows or a body condition issue, you know, if say you're weaning your calves in August and September, that's when you address it. You don't address it in the spring right before they calve, because you can't afford to put weight on your cows when they're heavy bred or right after they calve. A lactating cow is hard to put weight on to start with in the first 60 days. And in most situations, you just can't afford to do it. So you really need to body condition score your cows at weaning and see what they look like, and make sure that through the winter months you supplement them and keep them in shape so that they do calve at a body condition score 5, and that's going to help them overcome that postpartum interval and breed back. First calf heifers are even harder because they're still growing, and so there's a lot of different research and stuff that's been done on, you know, how heavy we need to get our heifers to get the best conception rate and different things like that. And I kind of stress to people there's ways that we can get replacement heifers bred, and we can get them bred at a lighter weight, I think, just because we understand puberty and things a lot better than we do now. But at some point, that heifer still has to grow. She still has to reach her mature cow weight, and the cheapest time to do it is when she's a replacement heifer, because she has, you know, less nutrient requirements. And so those heifers are still growing when they have their first calf. And so, you know, especially replacement heifers, you want to make sure that when they calve, they're in really good body condition score. It's going to be really difficult to catch them up if they're not.
Okay, perfect. I do have one last question. What are the effects of internal parasites? What effects internal parasites and coccidia have on first-time heifers?
Okay, I think they're talking about first calf heifers. You know, parasite loads and things like that are different kind of all across the country. Typically you're going to see those younger cows are a little more susceptible to some heavier parasite loads. You can sometimes manage those a little differently, and kind of leads back right into the question I was saying. You know, parasites affect the gastrointestinal tract. That's how they're absorbing their nutrients. And so obviously if we have anything that's hindering the health and productivity of their gastrointestinal tract, it's costing us money, because I'm putting feed in there and I want them to get every penny out of it that I put in them. So in a lot of cases, I think that using some of the more aggressive parasite control options that are out there, they cost a little bit more money, but a lot of them might give you some more extended control or some better control of the different parasites that you have. It's never a bad idea to pull a fecal sample. You can take it to your vet or your county agent or whoever you can get to do some parasite fecal counts, and just kind of look at what your parasite loads are and make sure you're controlling them. Because like I said, it's hard enough to keep weight on a first calf heifer. She's probably the most challenging animal in your herd to manage. And so if you've got a parasite issue, that's just going to compound and complicate things.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have today. Does anyone else have any other questions that are on the Zoom webinar? If you do, now's the time to ask us. I do also, since it is an extension webinar, I do have a Qualtrics survey if you guys could take. It's just a few questions just to let us know how we did and if you did learn anything from today. So we'd greatly appreciate it if you could take that. So, and if you do have questions in the future, if you think of something, because you know I always do that. I get home like, oh, I should have asked that. Just send me an email, or as well send Callan an email, or if need be, I can forward the email to her. So please let me know. And I just wanted to thank Callan so much for joining us today and sharing her wealth of knowledge. It was wonderful and I learned a ton. So thank you so much,
Well,
Callan.
I appreciate you putting this on for us, Brittany. I had fun. I always like talking about cows. So.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Can't thank you enough. So, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And please, like I said, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to ask. So.